Good evening, everyone. I'm Maura Tumulty. I'm currently the UP for Core 152. Welcome. The event this evening is a collaboration between Core 152, Professor Ryan Chase, and the members of the Manhattan String Quartet, Kurt Mecklenburg, Cal Wiersma, John Dexter, and Chris Finkel. Professor Chase and the members of the MSQ will be working together this evening to give you information about and an experience of string quartet performance, and of the composer Anton Webern in particular. I'd like to thank Nancy Reese, the University Studies Division Director, Kelly Snyder, the University Studies Administrative Assistant, and Lorraine Joseph, the Music Department's Concert Coordinator, for making this event possible. I'll say just a few brief words about the people we're lucky enough to be learning from today. Professor Chase, visiting assistant professor here at Colgate, is a composer, conductor, and pianist. His compositions have won multiple awards. They've been performed by the Chelsea Symphony and the San Francisco Opera Orchestra, among many others. He's performed with Questlove and is a founding member of the New Music Ensemble Holographic. The MSQ are celebrating their 46th season. They have been quartet in residence here at Colgate since 1988. They make regular concert tours throughout North America, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. They're widely renowned for their performances of 20th century classics, their important recording of Shostakovich string quartets, and for their advocacy of contemporary music through their commissioning of new work from composers. We are delighted to have them back with us again. Now, I know many of you will be taking buses and planes out of here tomorrow afternoon, but if anyone is still here, the MSQ will be giving a free concert here in the chapel at 7:30, so please come if you're in Hamilton. And before I turn the stage over to Professor Chase, and I'm not joking about anything I say, please take out your phones. Like, take them out, hold them up, like wave them at me. Come on, people. Now, look at your phone. Is it off or in airplane mode? Make that happen. Trust me, you do not want to be the person who thought their phone was off, and in a quiet moment, you suddenly realize it was on. Okay? Thank you very much. And enjoy the evening.
So, before we begin, it's important to note that Webern's 5 pieces for string quartet is but one piece. Classical music at the turn of the 20th century was more diverse than it had been in the history of its existence. Webern's effort is but one example of manifold aesthetic transformations that were occurring in the musical world. The piece you'll hear tonight, Webern's 5 pieces, is categorized as an example of Expressionism. However, it's only one of countless genres that were being developed and explored by his contemporaries. Music has always responded, consciously and unconsciously, to the philosophical axioms of its time. In order to understand the radical shifts that were occurring in the music of Webern and his contemporaries, we'll first undergo a highly abridged history of the development of harmony in the Western world. Western classical music is unique among other musics of the world in that it was the only widely practiced music that was written down into a codified system of notation. In many ways, the development of Western music owes its trajectory to the biases and predilections that occur when composers begin to think about the visual appearance of music on the page as opposed to just how it sounds. Our history begins after the decline of the Roman Empire. What survives of music from antiquity is so fragmented that we have very little to go on. Treatises on music from the classical era are impossible to parse, as they focus mostly on affect and the philosophical implications of different tunings. And aside from thorough descriptions of how various instruments were tuned and how they were supposed to work, which we can and do recreate in the modern era, we know very little about the actual aesthetic of that music from Greek and Roman times. For the most part, scholars are able to trace the development of Western music after the 6th century, because we have a large repertoire of music that has survived to the present day in written form. As to be expected in Europe at this time, this repertoire was compiled and sustained due to the efforts of the church. Musical thinking, even in the composition of secular song at the time, was wholly influenced by Christian doctrine. The music itself was monophonic, consisting of a single unaccompanied melody. It's difficult to imagine, given how open and welcoming our ears have become to all sorts of strange sounds, but at this time, adding a single note to harmonize a melody would have sounded highly dissonant or gratingly unpleasant to listeners in the Middle Ages. The umbrella term for music of this period is plain song, also known as plain chant, and there was a whole bunch of regional dialects: Mozartic chant, Byzantine chant, Armenian chant, but the dominant style was Gregorian chant, which was the central tradition of the Roman Catholic Church, named after Pope Gregory I. Okay, the apocryphal legend recorded that he channeled the form of plain song that was known as Gregorian chant single-handedly and directly from the voice of God. And here we can see a scribe taking dictation from Pope Gregory, and seated on his shoulder is a dove representing the Holy Spirit's divine inspiration. In actuality, though, clerical scholars did record that Gregorian chant arose from the synthesis of ancient Roman Christian chant and Gallic Christian chant when the Carolingian dynasty brought Roman Catholic ideas to France and the Iberian Peninsula. In many ways, these kings, Charlemagne in particular, had more to do with the proliferation of chant than Pope Gregory due to their military and political conquests. Plain song, in all of its iterations, was always organized by mode. If you've had any musical training or experience playing an instrument, a mode is very similar to a scale. However, because the music is organized differently around a mode versus it would be on a scale, we do make a differentiation. But for all intents and purposes, if you want to think about the two terms being like interchangeable, that works, because most of us modern composers and songwriters do anyway. A mode or scale gives us a palette of pitches to work with. A constellation of tones that are heard as subordinate to what we call the tonic, or the main pitch. For lack of a better word, we hear this tonic as sounding like the home of the scale, the most stable tone. So here we have what would be the Dorian Mode. It's built on the note D, which is highlighted in red. Re, re, there's our D, re, so this mode would sound re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, re, all the way up and down. Okay. Fun fact, if you run up the scale, run up the mode, the whole collection is called a gamut. So running the gamut literally means doing your scales. The other important tone is the reciting tone, which is highlighted in blue. Okay. So if you've heard the terms major or minor scale, those are the two most frequently modes that we have today. But back in the Middle Ages, there were as many as 14 different scales that composers were using to make songs and chants in various traditions. So let's look at one of them. This is Ave Maris Stellam, which was a hymn to Mary that was sung at Vespers as part of the Liturgy of the Hours. And it's based around that Dorian mode from the previous page. So there's our Dorian mode from D to D. And here we have a very strange and ancient notation called Pneumatic Notation. So to perform this, you would have to understand where that D is, which is that first note on that staff. So to perform this, it would be something like Ave Maris Stella Dei Mater Alma atque semper Virgo Felix Celi porta. I am no singer, but most of those people aren't at the time, right? So most of the music is stepwise, moving from one note to the other, right? We have a lot of these little florid little flourishes, but there are a number of dramatic leaps that we hear. And you'll notice that the most prominent and the largest of these leaps always occur between the tonic, the red notes, and the reciting tone, which is the blue note. And the truth is, aside from those observations that we have a lot of stepwise motion and that the most important leaps occur between these two tones, we don't know much about how they were constructing these chants, which is really strange, right? We have absolutely no idea as to the inner workings or aesthetics that these composers were working on. They were mostly being guided by their ear at the time. If you've studied music, you'll also notice that there's really no rhythmic indication here, right? If you've studied music, you know things about eighth notes, quarter notes, 16th notes maybe, that tell us how long certain notes are supposed to be, but there is no durational notation here. There's no internal pulse, there's no internal beat. And that's pretty foreign to a lot of us who study music. And it's interesting to note that the development of stricter durational values coincided with the development of mechanical clocks and horologes used by the church. Some music theorists believe that the conceit of dividing time was only permitted in music after it was actually applied to the day itself. As music became more rhythmicized, composers began to explore polyphony, or music that had more than one harmonic line. Early on, this was just a doubling of the melody, but starting on different notes. They might sing that chant with one person singing what I sang, and another person starting on a different note higher than that. But some theorists would argue that it's just monophony, right? We're just kind of doing the same thing in parallel motion on top of each other. Actual polyphony is quite different. Most of the music we listen to today is what we would call homophonic, where we have a main melody accompanied by chords. So we would have a singer also playing chords on a guitar, on a piano, or accompanied by synthesizers or electronic instruments. But in a polyphonic texture, every part is considered a distinct melodic line and is equally important to the music. And that results in a really complex web of sound. So in just a relatively short while, just a few centuries, music became astoundingly complex. So here we're going to have an example from Guillaume de Machaut's Missa de Nostre Dame. It's the oldest surviving complete mass by a single composer. This music, just like the Ave Maristella, is organized in that same mode, that Dorian mode. So those were still going on throughout the Renaissance. And the functions of the tonic, the main note, and the reciting tone, that secondary note in blue, still operate in the same way. You'll also note that the rhythms are now definitely in place, right? If you've studied music, you can see some half notes, some quarter notes, things that tell us exactly how long everything is supposed to go, which makes sense, because if we have more than one player, we need to make sure everyone's on the same page as far as that goes. You'll also notice that the meter was in 3. It's a little bit small, you can't really see that. But most music was expressed in 3, especially liturgical music, to represent the divinity of the Trinity. So let's have a listen to what medieval polyphony sounded like. So as you can hear, the music has what we would call a pitch centricity on D and A. These two pitches, when they sound together, ground the music and offer pillars of stability between these extended, almost improvisatory flights of fancy. And most Renaissance music is characterized by this extemporaneous, florid weaving of melodic lines between occasional moments of harmonic and rhythmic repose. But the actual music itself almost sounds alien. There's a familiar melodic motion, and vertically things tend to align in ways ways we would expect, but the motion from one chord to the next chord almost seems too jarring or frivolous, and they can be really strange to the modern ear. And this is a personal side, but I'm always a little disappointed in like film and movie soundtracks that try to emulate the style, because it always comes off a little too bland. It always holds a little too closely to the main notes and never really goes far enough in exploring these bizarre harmonic directions that the music takes. Composers from the Renaissance are often described as freewheeling, and eventually these composers began to argue about the right way to put these chords together. So as you know, the Renaissance was a period of time from which thinkers from all disciplines were looking back to antiquity for truth. In music, this contributed to the idea that music could carry an extra musical rhetorical meaning, and there could exist such a thing as a musical dialectic. And this translated into a rigorous codification of scales, keys, and how chords were allowed to move from one to the other. And the training of composers began to focus on the specific functions of certain chords and how they related back to that tonic, that primary note of the key or the scale. And additionally, composers were taught specific stock musical phrases and ideas which we call schemata. So for a composer to be considered talented by their contemporaries, they had to be able to decorate these standard progressions in very inventive ways. This could be the way a melody pushes or pulls against a harmonic blueprint, the orchestration of a passage, how it's divided into instruments in really special and interesting ways, or entirely innovative ways of treating rhythm and meter. So what you're about to hear is a quartet by Mozart that the quartet here will be playing tomorrow night in concert here in the chapel. If you've ever seen the film Amadeus, anyone? No? A couple people. Yeah. So you remember Emperor Joseph II's criticism of Mozart's music, too many notes. And in many ways, the filigree in Mozart's music really challenged the dogmatic system of schemata that was happening at the time. So let's hear just a little bit of K465. So at this point, the music seems to be organized in a texture that's more relatable to genres we might be more familiar with. We definitely have a melody, a primary melody played by the first violin, and the other instruments offer an accompaniment. But we can hear that that accompaniment isn't just umpas, it's constantly engaged with the other instruments and with the melody itself. At times, there seems to be a call and response, which we would call antiphony, and at other times, the accompaniment really pushes rhythmically to help drive the music forward. And as far as the organization of the music horizontally, it's a lot easier to hear where phrases begin and end. Harmonically, our ears are guided to understand where the first phrase, that first section of music, ends in the eighth measure, where that blue line is. The music then begins again, just like it did the first time around, but the harmony brings the music to a more stable cadence or conclusion. Rhetorically, you might say that the music mimics a dependent clause of a sentence followed by an independent clause of a sentence. And the musical ideas established in just this 16-bar excerpt would then be developed by Mozart and recast in different ways, modulating or changing to different keys, exploring secondary ideas picked up along the way, before returning home to this primary material. And this could be comparable to how an essayist might make a thesis statement at the beginning of an article, and then back up that statement with logical proof based on facts, reinforcing her argument. The next century would see composers challenging the schemata of music theory in increasingly radical ways. Ludwig van Beethoven can be seen as the first composer who would really push the following three musical limits. The first would be modulation, moving to ever more foreign keys from the original key, the original scale that he established. And as a result of that, pieces became a lot longer, needed a lot more time for the music to be able to logically get back to where we began, but still make sense syntactically in the music of the time. And instrumentation. The orchestra started to become massive. Around Mozart's time, the orchestra probably had about 8 wind instruments, 2 horns, maybe 2 trumpets, and about 20 to 30 string players in the orchestra, and a timpanist, one who would play the kettle drums in the back of the orchestra. By the end of the 19th century, by around 1900, Your orchestra could have anywhere between 4 or 5 wind players for every instrument, so 4 or 5 flutes, 4 or 5 oboes, 4 or 5 clarinets, 4 or 5 bassoons, 8 horn players, 6 trumpet players, 6 trombones, 3 tubas, 10 percussionists. How many string players? Like hundreds of string players? You know, a whole bunch of them, yeah. Get them all together and get a whole huge orchestra going on. So everything was just getting bigger and bigger. Eventually, schema were abandoned, but the basic building blocks of chords themselves remained the same. These are the 3-note chords built on the interval of the third, which we call triads, which we're going to come back to in a little bit. Eventually, however, these triads came under scrutiny as composers sought stranger and stranger sounds. We don't have time to really get into the Schopenhauerian aesthetics of Wagner, but he subscribed to the idea that music had the power to transcend what was happening at the time, had the power to transcend traditionally linguistic modes of thinking, and even transform a listener's perception of time and reality. He sought to suspend the listener's ordinary perception of his or herself in the world and the passage of time around them. In the prelude to his opera, Tristan und Isolde, the music, going by at a snail's pace, is built on a number of very strange chords highlighted in gold. We hear a twisting, yearning desire for resolution to a place of harmonic stability, but it never comes. Let's have a listen to the prelude to Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. That piece goes on for about 3 hours. So we'd be here all night. Yeah, his pieces are long. And you really don't get a nice, firm conclusion until the end of them, which is really wild, the way he constructs these pieces that suspend our sense of resolution for so long. In addition to composers' radical rethinking of the expressive power of music, there was also a desire to rebel against the conventional practice of harmony that had been dominating for the last 250 years. Composers looked back to the more capricious era, the medieval, the Renaissance, as sources for inspiration. And this, accompanied by a greater interest in music from around the world, led to a crescendo of artistic cross-pollination. Claude Debussy, a French composer, heard Javanese gamelan music at the 1889 Paris World Exposition, and it profoundly influenced his thinking about musical time, melody, and harmony. This, combined with his love for Renaissance music, resulted in a pastiche style that blended conventional harmony with chant, Eastern traditions, and cutting-edge sonorities. We're going to hear an example from his string quartet, the slow movement. inch by inch, year by year, things were getting stranger and stranger. And by the turn of the 20th century, this decadence in music was reaching a tipping point. And for all of these harmonic revolutions, the music itself is still rather lush and very aurally sensual. The next 4 decades would see an explosion of vastly divergent and distinct styles. The one we're focusing on today is just one of them, and it started with Arnold Schoenberg. Arnold Schoenberg was Webern's teacher and is considered the father of musical expressionism. His cadre of pupils was known as the Second Viennese School. It was based in Vienna and was a reference to the classical Viennese school of Haydn, who taught Mozart and Beethoven. His first stylistic period was very romantic, so very similar to the music of Wagner and the music of Debussy that we first heard. So it followed in that footstep, but with even more departures from the norm. It wasn't until around 1908 when he abandoned the idea of traditional harmony or tonality altogether, a term called atonal music by theorists, but it was a term that Schoenberg despised. Atonal music is music that is not built on any mode, any scale, any key, or any tonic. And he aimed to liberate music entirely from the confines of traditional harmonic thinking. Later in his life, he would codify his system into what he called serialism, which was a rigid ordering of the 12 chromatic pitches on the piano. This musical development is determined by the mathematical manipulation of a main melody called a tone row in which each pitch is used only once. And if you're a graduate student in music, these give you an entirely new vocabulary of obscenity to deal with because they are really difficult to parse out and deal with, harmonically speaking. The first thing we have up here are tertian triads. These are the building blocks of everything we've heard up until Debussy. So music that has a major chord, a minor chord, diminished chord, augmented chords, major chord, bom, 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 bom. Right? We have this very, very firm, very stable harmonic sound. But then Schoenberg came along and started writing these atonal chords, these chords that are made with different constructions of different notes put together, and finally culminated by using those strange constructs, these really weird combinations of pitches to make 12-tone rows, using every note that's available on the piano only once, and then mathematically manipulating it in different ways. But we're going to focus on that second period, that expressionist period. Webern was one of Schoenberg's most successful pupils, and one can see that his stylistic trajectory almost exactly aligns with that of his teacher. He was reserved, cerebral, monkish in his habits. For his doctorate at the University of Vienna, he wrote a dissertation on Renaissance music. His early works were very romantic and drew heavily from Wagner, Strauss, Mahler, and Debussy. And as he studied with Schoenberg, he enthusiastically changed course and joined the search for these new strange sounds and timbres, embracing Expressionism and then later in his life, serialism, as Schoenberg did. So, Expressionism, let's focus on that since that is the style of the piece we're going to hear tonight. So from its definition, it came from Germany, and it's definitely representational, as you can read from the description here. So from the description and this example from Art Edward Munch's The Scream, Expressionism is a representational art form. We can definitely assign real objects to all of these figures and objects in the painting. We can see someone in the foreground, we see what looks like a fence, 2 figures in the background, a sky, a lake, and some forest around it. However, everything has been grotesquely distorted to graphically emphasize the angst and horror of that foreground figure. So everything is real. It's not surreal. It's not cubist. It's not like we're taking these ideas and then cutting them up and putting them in different places. Everything is still where it should be, but it's very, very drastically distorted. Schoenberg was a painter of himself. Here's a picture that he drew of himself. You can see he looks like a real charming guy in this expressionistic depiction he made of himself. He has a couple more ordinary ones that I think he made just to please his friends and wife who were in his parlor often, because just that alone is a bit creepy. But let's hear how this expressionist aesthetic then translates musically. We're going to hear the opening 17 bars of Webern's 5 pieces for string quartet. So, what's expressionist about it? It's emotionally manic. The texture is just frantic, the music turns on a dime. There's an emphasis on these extreme dynamic contrasts between whisper quiet and incredibly loud. We heard the incorporation of unconventional methods of playing these string instruments. You heard them bowing very close to the bridge, termed Umsteg or sul punticello in the score, which gives the music a really raspy quality, very glassy quality. The players were striking the strings with the wood of the bow, plucking the strings with their fingers, playing harmonics to achieve notes that are beyond the conventional range of the instrument. But in spite of all this, there are still certain aspects of the music that remain unchallenged. For the most part, we still are moving from left to right, so we think of it in linear time. We're hearing ideas regarding polyphony, multiple simultaneous voices going on at the same time. And in the opening to the second movement, we can hear homophony, something where there's just a clear primary melody and a chordal accompaniment, even though the pitch collections being used are no longer based on those triadic structures used from the Renaissance all the way through the 19th century. So we're shattering about 300, 400 years of tradition here with a piece like this. Let's hear the first 4 bars of that second movement from Webern's 5 pieces. Beautiful, yeah. So as we experience it, we're still experiencing it in the same way. Yeah, the sounds are weird. They're really, really weird, very strange, very bizarre. But at the same time, we're still experiencing it as we would any other rhythm, melody, and harmonic accompaniment. Okay. It wasn't until the middle and late 20th century, so through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way to the present day, that these most fundamental aspects of music, harmony, melody, linear time, began to be really challenged by artists like Milton Babbitt, John Cage, who wrote the famous silent piece that you may have heard of, a piece where a performer comes in, sits at the piano and does nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds and then leaves the stage. Composers like Terry Riley, Helmut Lachenmann, and George Ligeti. As bizarre as the harmonic world in this music still is, it still remains linked to the past in many of its most fundamental features. So we could say that it's representational. Just like Munch's painting was clearly a picture of a human, this is still clearly a melody and an accompaniment. However, the emotional features have been dramatically augmented to express angst or wistfulness, or quiet, or rage. So the emotions are amplified. However, the music still remains representational. As the style became antiquated, it was seen as yet another set of aesthetic tools for composers to portray specific ideas. Expressionism still survives today in soundtracks to film, television, and video games, usually in the horror and action genres, to orally depict the surreal, the grotesque, and the macabre. Bernard Herrmann's scores for Alfred Hitchcock's thrillers owe a great deal to Webern and the Second Viennese School. So we're going to consider Psycho. The music in this film score is not derived from tertian triads, the basic building blocks of most normal harmony, but from these pitch sets that were being developed by the Second Viennese School. So we're going to listen to the prelude from the film Psycho, and then compare that to the opening of the third movement of Webern's 5 pieces back to back. sort of been cleaned up to make it more palatable to a wider audience. We have, in the Webern, pitch sets moving. They're the same pitch set. They're all in blue, but the notes are all different. Back in the Hermann, these pitch sets last for longer time, so it allows our ears to adjust and become accustomed to these strange sonorities. Webern gives us no such opportunity. He's constantly moving from one crazy pitch set to another crazy pitch set. And yeah, they may all be from the same mathematical sort of algorithm that he's using to compute them, but to our ear it sounds a lot harder to follow than something like the Hermann. Let's listen to another excerpt from the score. We're going to hear a comparison between the establishing shot of Psycho, which was of the city of Phoenix, which involves these beautiful descending chords, and the fifth movement of Webern's 5 pieces for string quartet. First the Hermann. So again, a lot of repetition of the same pitch sets. If we look at Webern's example, this is a bit smaller, sorry about that, but you can see that he's doing a very similar texture, a very similar affect, but the chords are changing on almost every iteration as they descend down. Expressionist music, and especially Webern's music, hangs in this limbo between the chaotic noise of life and the grim stillness of death and the unknown. And the ease with which one melts into the other is the major insight that we can gain from his work. Contemporary intellectuals in Vienna at Webern's time were concerned with the limits of language, with the need for a kind of communicative silence. Wittgenstein once wrote, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," marking the boundary between rational discourse and the world of the internal, the world of the soul. The German writer Hermann Roch ended his novel The Death of Vigil with the phrase "Das Wort jenseits der Sprache," the word beyond speech. And the impulse to go beyond nothingness, beyond silence, is central to Webern's aesthetic. The still silences between the screams seeming all the more fragile. In listening to the 5 pieces for string quartet, we are not meant to understand the mathematical processes which unify the piece, but to feel them intuitively. With a harmonic vocabulary so complex it could be equivalent to nonsense, we're invited to lose ourselves in the sheer visceral beauty of sound while contemplating the manifold emotions inside us and the power they wield. So please join me in thanking the Manhattan String Quartet for being with us tonight as they present Webern's Fünf Stücke for Streich Quartet by Anton Webern. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to play the complete piece now. It's about 8 minutes long. Although I thank you so much for applauding after each time we I talked to the classes about that today. In this particular performance of the pieces, if you could just withhold your applause until the very end. So we're going to play each piece is a couple of minutes long, something like that. Sort of experience the silence between each of these pieces. And then when we're done at the very end, if you liked it, then you can applaud, okay? So here's the Vapor in 5 pieces.